session. Welcome to Open Source Health Factors. This is the phase 1 report. So with us is David Wedaman, who is a longtime work colleague of mine. He and I worked together for many, many years at Brandeis University in Massachusetts, and it's been really neat to bring him to the Sakai Virtual Conference to talk about this project that he's been doing. There's a subversive group of us in the Sakai community who are looking at the long-term health of the community, and we asked Dave to do a little bit of research to figure out what are some of the aspects and drivers of health. And so what you're going to hear in this 35 minutes is the initial findings from that piece of work. So let me tell you a bit about Dave. He goes by Dr. David Wedaman. He's a researcher, he's an organizational psychologist, he is an organizational development consultant, and he is a developmental coach in Cambridge, Massachusetts. He's got a background in teaching, learning, and administration in higher ed, IT, and library contexts. And he and I spent time in the IT and library context. He specializes in consulting and research geared to support healthy organizational design and function. And he works primarily in education, nonprofit, and arts-related organizations. So those of you who were here earlier heard about one of his many arts-related organizations, the ever-crazy Honk Band in Massachusetts. Dave's areas of expertise include assessment, research, learning, team building, systems change, talent management, innovation, collaboration, communities of practice, decision-making, and adult development. So let me offer a few housekeeping thoughts, and then we'll get right to it. So definitely remember to mute yourself when you're not speaking. So feel free to unmute yourself whenever you want to talk. We're a small group. We're only 9 people, including Dave and me. So feel free to unmute yourself and say something, but feel free also when you're done talking to mute yourself again. Feel free to lodge any questions in the chat if you'd rather put them there instead of speaking up. It's totally up to you. So put questions in there. I will surface them to Dave at disruptive points in his presentation. And we'll get them answered and get some discussion going. We are recording this session, so the video is going to be available a little bit later on, probably late next week, I would guess, on the Sakai YouTube channel. And definitely, if you have any troubles of a technical nature with audio or video, put something in the chat, and I'll be glad to help you out. So, Dave, tell us about open source health factors.
Thank you, Josh, for the kind introduction, and everybody. Josh is one of my favorite people. Yes, I think we're going on our 2nd decade of collaboration here. And it's fun to be able to work with someone that long and still be friends.
Scary, but true.
Yes, and a big thank you to Josh and Longsight and the Sakai community for sponsoring this research. And thank you to the conference for bringing me in to talk about a project that I think is cool. And I hope you will too. So let's just drop in. So open source health factors. I am going to figure out how to progress my slides. Here we go. So our agenda for today. We're not sure we're going to make it through the whole thing, but we're going to try to get through the first 3 or 4 bullets at least, and the 5th is if we're lucky. I'm going to talk about the Open Source Health Factors project. We have just finished phase 1 and are moving into phase 2, so it's a great time to talk about what we learned in phase 1. And I'm sorry, I'm reading the chat. Okay. And we started phase 2 with a survey that we actually distributed today at the conference, and we have some quick analysis of the results from that survey already to report on in this presentation. So let's start talking about open source. Okay. Open source health factors. So it is a project that is designed to answer basically these questions. Or something like these questions. So if you're in an open source community, just imagine you are for a second, how do you know that the project you're on or the community you're in is quote unquote healthy, is functioning, is highly functioning, is functioning well, and people are being taken care of and everything's working well? What factors would you look for to assess whether the community is functioning and vibrant and productive? And if you could identify those factors, could you also build some kind of a tool or a process or a protocol that would let anybody in any open source community self-assess, or at least think about doing a kind of a self-audit on the health of their particular project and determine what's good and what needs to be worked on. those are our guiding questions, and this is the project that we put together to, at a very high level, the phases of the project that we put together to address these questions. So 4-phase project, just finished phase 1. So phase 1 was, let's look at the relevant research literature to find ideas for factors that could determine health in an open source community. And I see phase 1 report is linked right there. So you can actually read the report. It's a draft report. There's one unfinished paragraph, but it's mostly there. And we took the list of factors that we developed from research, looking at the research literature, to a select group of Sakai community members, just to make sure that we weren't way off target. This was a few weeks ago. They said we were on target, so we've kept going. Phase 2, if phase 1 was about getting information from the research literature, phase 2 is about getting information from the actual world of people working in open source. So that's beginning now with the survey that we distributed today that we'll report on later. And phase 3 takes the information from both those phases, from the research literature and from the open source community, puts them together, and hopefully prototypes some kind of assessment process. And if that works well, then phase 4 is to distribute whatever tool we develop in phase 3 to open source communities to try out. Here are the phases spread out over a calendar with colors. So you can see we just finished phase 1, which was look at the literature review and propose some primary factors, which we'll report on in just about a second. We're in phase 2, engage and refine, where we're engaging with the community. In addition to the survey that we've started here, we'll be doing observations and interviews to gather more data. After that, we foresee in the beginning of next year, if we're on track, to start to model a tool, prototype a tool, and then maybe late spring, early summer, start talking about sharing that tool with communities to try out. Okay, so what did we discover in phase 1? Well, we were looking at research literature, anything that could be relevant, potentially relevant to the health factor in an open source community, and we looked at a lot of stuff. And these are the main areas of research that we thought were relevant. I'm just going to talk briefly about these so you know what they are, and I'll dig into them in more detail later in the presentation. Communities of practice, communities of practice are groups of people who get together to support a particular profession or practice, like the midwives. It's a community that forms around a given practice. And the research literature studies this interesting phenomenon because they have particularly interesting rules, and they're a little bit different than traditional organizations. Popular open source works, the second bullet. It just so happens in the open source community that people in the open source community write about being in the open source community, which is a wonderful collection of information, first-person accounts of how things work. So there's a lot of great ideas there. Motivation literature is a subset of psychology. And these are people that are trying to understand what motivates people, what makes people engage and buy in and work. Information sciences is the official research area for open source, in as much as it's a technological, computational sort of project. You're doing software design. So these are people that study communication, computers, information technology. Organizational development, that's my particular field. These are people that study organizations and how to understand where they're working and where they're not, and how to improve them. Team effectiveness is a focused research area that focuses just on teams and how teams work. And they have a lot of ideas that are applicable because, of course, open source, like just about any other organization, uses teams to get things done. The management literature, of course, is widely available, Harvard Business Review, et cetera. It's about how you manage and organize people and get them to work together. And finally, the lifecycle theory literature studies organizations as if assumes they are going to evolve through a set of stages or phases that are predictable. So those are the literatures that we look through. And combing through all those things, we found basically 8 factors or 8 areas of potential future factors. Let me say it that way, because we haven't actually built the assessment, but we think 8 areas that we might think about as we start to build the assessment. And we group these into categories. And so we group them into people categories, task category, and the organization category, which means the open source, thinking of the open source community as an organization itself. And so I'll just drop into those. But before I start to explain those, were there any questions, Josh, from the first part of the presentation I should respond to?
So there are no questions in the chat at this point. Does anyone want to raise a question before we move on?
About anything up till here?
All right, let's continue on then.
Good. Okay, so we'll start with the people factors. Okay, so the first people factors are what we're calling community of practice factors. Spoke a little bit about this a few slides back. Communities of practice are really interesting. They're people that get together to support a practice. And when you organize to do that, it ends up that you use different norms than you would if you organized for other purposes, like to be efficient or to get things done, which are usually the purposes of most organizations. And so we think, as we looked at this literature, we thought there was a lot of relationship between it and open source communities, which maybe are a kind of community of practice. So we think that drawing on some aspect of the literature around community of practice might figure into our assessment. And I'll just grab one example. One of the most distinguishing features about a community of practice is that roles are flexible. You can enter into the community as a novice, and in the community there will be ways for you to learn and change your role and grow and become an expert and shift out of expert into administrator. And so that fluidity, which is called lateral participant, there's a word for LPP, lateral participant progression or something like that, is a characteristic of communities of practice that we think is in open source as well. So, and there are others that we may draw on. Motivational factors, spoke a little bit about this. Essentially, one of the interesting things about the first decade of research on open source communities is that researchers didn't understand why people were doing the work. Why would programmers spend so much time and effort working for a project that wasn't paying them? And so motivation seems to be a factor. But those researchers were largely not familiar with the motivation literature. One moment.
Are you definitely?
I had someone just walk in, sorry. Excuse me. So they weren't familiar with the motivation literature, and the motivation literature basically explains why someone would actually be engaged by projects such as open source. And so in short, motivation literature basically says that the way you get people to do things is not through carrot and stick, which is the traditional understanding, not through paying them or threatening them or coercing them, but through other things, offering them an opportunity to learn and grow, offering an opportunity to grow their reputation, offering relationships. And these are things that when you have them in place, we call them job enrichment. And I'm gonna just take 1 minute and help this person out, and I'll be right back. One second.
So while Dave steps away for a second, I will vamp for just a moment. There was a comment raised to me privately, which I'll share because all of you can see this. So for those of you who have looked at the open source health factors draft report, you'll notice that the comment stream from those of us who are working on this previously is visible to you guys. So we have been trying, and I always try hard for lots and lots of transparency. We're a community where we can let it all hang out. So it is. I think it's good and useful to allow that transparency of the comment stream. So thank you to Katie Reynolds for quietly mentioning that to me, and it's good that you guys get to see the inner workings as we go. I think that's important. So let me ask if anyone has any questions at this stage in the presentation before we move on. Any questions about people factors?
I'm back.
Dave is back.
Sorry, that was the security. I may be in the wrong room. I think I'm supposed to be in the room across the hall, but we worked it out. So did we have any questions while I was away?
Nope, no questions. Let's charge on.
Charge on. Okay, I apologize for that, but hopefully you're able to get a tea or a coffee or take a breath or something. Team effectiveness factors, as I mentioned before, these are people that study effectiveness of teams, and they have all kinds of criteria for what makes an effective team. And so we think I think I selected way too many examples here, and there's hundreds more. So we think there'll definitely be 2 or 3 interesting ideas that we can draw on here to inform our assessment. We're gonna move on. We're moving into task category now. So those were people. Now we're thinking about the work itself. So an obvious area of measurable things are things that you can measure. So quantifiable metrics, we're calling them. The presentation did not change, someone told me. Can you see me moving forwards now to quantifiable metrics? Josh?
I only see motivational factors.
No, we're still on motivational factors.
Okay, hang on.
There you go.
There we go. Quantifiable metrics. There we go. Very good.
All right, we're in quantifiable metrics. And then this was I saw this one. I talked about this one before I moved on. Apologies, folks. Okay, quantifiable metrics. So most of the people that think about how you measure open source health factors measure the things that are easy to measure. Inputs and outputs, things you can count. And we think those are important. So we want to include those. A good example is Aperio sustainability metrics, where they're counting a lot of factors that are important. So we'll include these in the assessment in some way. The challenge is to know for a given project what the right range is on any one of these metrics, because one project might need 2 programmers and be healthy, and one might need 100 to be healthy. So that's something we're going to have to get our heads around as we think about the assessment portion. Quality of performance factors is another one. You can count what people do, but then how do you know if what people are doing is of high quality? This is a thing that we're going to have to measure somehow. And I'm not sure how we'll do it, but it seems to be necessary. The work product has to be quality of work product has to be a function of the assessment. And finally, processes. Open source projects will need to have certain kinds of processes. I don't think the assessment will specify which, for instance, version control software you will be using, but I think we'll be looking that you have one and looking for other kinds of processes that are proven to be necessary in an open source project. Finally, I'm moving on to the purple organization projects. So the first is probably the hardest one to explain in all of these factors. And this comes from the recognition, this interorganizational factors. This comes from the recognition that open source communities seem to be often coupling in a loose way with non-open source organizations. They're forming relationships that matter and that sustain them with traditional organizations. This is something that happens in the community of practice literature too, where the community of practice has different norms, but needs to connect with a traditional organization and vice versa. There's a symbiotic thing there. And you can see this in open source when an open source project joins a foundation or forms its own foundation to support operational aspects or other aspects, or when institutional members are part of a project, or a given company will dedicate programmer time, so the programmer is both in the community but also in a for-profit organization. That loose coupling of different kinds of organizations seems to be prevalent. So I'm not sure how it plays out in the assessment, but it seems to be a key thing. Perhaps there's a certain phase where you move into this phase, we're looking for partnership with an outside organization. Moving on to that, finally, the last factor is lifecycle factor. And this is just the idea that if it's true that organizations move through predictable phases, and knowing these phases helps you understand how to measure that organization at that particular state, then our assessment ought to be able to be aware of those things. And it does seem like people in the open source community have started to think about open source projects in a lifecycle sort of way. For example, Aperio has projects in incubation, and then they get out of incubation, which suggests 2 stages right there, the incubation stage and the post-incubation stage. And in life cycle theory, there's 4 or 5 stages that most researchers agree upon. So my sense is that we'll probably be able to find equivalent stages in the open source project community and be able to guess at what the criteria for each stage is and build that into the assessment, which then makes it a better assessment because it can be more accurate. It can be accurate to each, whatever stage you happen to be in, instead of holding all organizations to a particular stage of maturity. Okay.
Can I make
Please.
a comment on that last?
Yeah, let's
So
talk.
in the last one,
Talk the question.
you were talking about life stage for organizations, but your examples are all about life stages for individual projects, which an organization might run. So how does that?
The main thing there is they're bad examples. So I think I'm just using the word projects to represent open source organizations.
Right, because when you talk about incubation for a project, that is definitely a project, not an organization.
Right. So when I'm saying organization, we may need to define what an organization is. Now that you mentioned, Kathy, where are the edges of the entity that we want to measure is a good question. So right, exactly. So I think, what does the project think? So let's strike the word project from that and say, I don't know exactly what we'd say, but a given project, when we say, okay, what's Sakai? What would you call that? A project?
It's both.
Okay.
I mean, these days we're trying to get away from the project label because a project has a beginning and an end.
But you have a good point, which is there may be a higher level organization that we want to help assess its health, and then we may want to give some attention to a subunit project.
Yeah, and see, the thing is, when you talked about the community of professionals on the beginning slide, right,
Uh-huh.
because I've seen this in many other places, they can adopt and do different projects because they're flexible, like even midwives. They may have a project to do like better legal stuff in this area, and then they get that done and they go on to another one where there's an organizational community, where Sakai is just like that, because there's Sakai as a organization promoting this LMS, and then there are individual projects within Sakai where we're improving and doing different releases and different kinds of things.
You're right, though. Getting the unit of analysis nailed down at the beginning so that we know what it is we're studying is a smart move.
It's a really good point. And it's even inherent in the factors that we picked, because we picked team effectiveness. So teams are a subset of an organization. So if we're looking at team effectiveness, that's
this was the only one that seemed out of sync with all the others. That's why I brought it up.
All right. That's good feedback. Thank you, Kathy. Is that Kathy? Thank you, Kathy.
Yeah.
All right. Other questions about any of these? I can say one thing, that other people that have looked at these factors from open source community have been somewhat surprised. I think they're not the default factors that you would generate from your experience working in open source, and that's because we drew them from research that's not necessarily even related directly, but indirectly to open source communities. And it's in phase 2 that we hope to integrate the actual experience of people, professionals living in the world into this. So we haven't quite integrated that yet. So if they seem strange or different or abstract, that's because they are coming from a different place, research. Shall I move on? How are we doing on time?
We have about 11 minutes, so we're in good shape.
Yeah, right. And there's a chance the security may come back in around 3:55. So we just, that's true. So what we did at the survey today was we shared, at the conference today, is we shared a link to a survey, 2-question survey. That's the prototype of a survey we expect to use in phase 2 more broadly. It has 2 questions, and it just asks, as an open source professional, what factors do you think in your experience or lead to open source project success, and the converse, which factors do you think lead to open source struggle? And at 2 p.m. I jumped on, we had 9 responses, and I quickly coded them. So you're the first people to see the very first response on this prototype survey, and here they are. So you're looking at a qualitative coding schema. So there's I'm applying codes, and then I'm defining the code. So what we're seeing basically is 9 respondents, but 9, 10, 11, 12, 13 ideas. I'm counting ideas. I'm counting potential factors. And so 3 of the potential factors, or 23%, were for what contributes to healthy open source projects, and in the opinion of people living in them, is about a focus on user experience or usability. Equal tied with that is this idea that there's some kind of a special spirit. Relatedness is a word that I drew from the responses. Relatedness, camaraderie, generosity, collaboration. Should have spelled that out. Equal to that was this idea of community involvement. I'm not sure exactly what that meant, but it was mentioned 3 times. Community involvement, strong community. And then 4 additional ideas, only coming in once each, that the project has the ability to solve problems, that companies are involved, which kind of hints at that loose linkage factor that I was thinking about, that outcomes are defined and that there's leadership. Thoughts or questions about these before we move on to the unhealthy factors? Anything strike you as interesting or funny as you look at this, or something you connect with?
So Dave, I've got a question of clarification. When we look at the user code, emphasis on user experience or usability,
Yep.
is that for the user of the product, or the user as in the individual that interacts with the community?
I took it to mean the product, because they're talking about experience. Yes.
Oh yeah, you're right. Attention to the end user experience. Sure. Sure. Okay. Any other questions that folks have?
Something interesting on that. They said it should be as easy for the user to use the product as it is for the developer to develop the product.
I would hope it'd be easier.
Yeah, I know.
Watching the developers and how they struggle with stuff.
Developing is hard, so okay. So let's take a look at the next. Let's advance the slide, David. Okay, here we go. So a lot more ideas on question 2, what makes for unhealthy, and not as many things linked together immediately, but as I read these, I think there's a lot of overlap and I might combine. So the first that I'm coding, comms coordination, is talking about a community is going to suffer if it doesn't have good communication or coordination. So that came up 3 times. Then there's the converse of some of the ideas, and the first one pops up here. So one person said, if you don't pay attention to user experience, it's going to suffer. Another said, if there's none of this feeling of togetherness, a spirit, it's going to suffer. Another one said, if it can't solve problems, it'll suffer. One person said, I can't think of anything. The projects I've been on have all been successful. Another said, if they can't prioritize among multiple ideas, that's going to suffer, which actually sort of feels like it might be part of coordination or communication. Another said, if you make changes without, that you know are going to cause problems without fixing those problems, that's going to cause trouble. And that also sounds like communication or coordination too. Another said, if you only have one person writing the code, that's a problem. Another said, absence of the community or fracturing of the community, as when you fork the code. And finally, if you can't agree on a strategy about where to go, which also sort of feels related to coordination, problem solving, prioritization.
One of the things that strikes me about this is that user and spirit were more prevalent for healthy open source projects. So they came up 3 times for healthy projects and only once each for unhealthy projects. I wonder what that means. I mean, is user experience a greater contributor to success and less of a detractor when it's not going well? And likewise for the relatedness of people?
Yeah, it's interesting. When I saw this, I immediately thought, maybe it's not a good idea to have 2 questions that are symmetrical, because you might just get knee-jerk symmetrical responses, right? But we're not seeing that. We're seeing a little bit of that. We're seeing different responses to the unhealthy factors, as you point out. Spirit, community, the first things people notice on the healthy, and on the unhealthy, they're pointing to this coordination, strategic planning, not prioritization piece.
And that's kind of interesting because it's multifaceted. I mean, on the one hand, there's coordination of the discussions and the relationships and the work that's being done among people, and on the other hand, there's coordination of the development itself. You know, so it strikes me that premature fix and prioritization might be related to development, but not to the efforts of working groups.
There is a link.
Yeah. Okay.
And the link is if you're doing like changes and fixes, you know, when you know there's not problems, then you have no attention to user experience, because you're focused on getting your fix in and your reputation or whatever the reason that you're doing it, but you're not really caring about the user actually being able to use the functionality because you put bugs in there that you knew about. So there are some linkages in these things. And I suspect you'll find that some of these answers were from developers and some of these were from educational designers.
It might be neat to ask who the person is to let them self-identify.
Yeah, you need some demographic data on it.
Yeah, that's a good point. Thank you, Kathy.
Or at least their role within the community.
That's what I mean by demographic.
Yeah,
just role only. You don't need people, you know, just the roles.
The doubly neat thing about that would be that we would have some data about role fluidity in open source based on the people that answer this thing, because we could have some predefined roles they could select, or we could leave it open and let them tell us additional roles that we hadn't thought of.
Yeah.
So it is 3:57. I want to offer the 3-minute warning here. And I also want to say thanks to folks for, you know, giving us feedback and, you know, taking a thoughtful pass at some of these factors. I mean, so this is very early in the process, and you know, the trick now is to try and make sense of these and to, you know, prioritize these appropriately, figure out how best to use them to measure ourselves against. So thanks for taking some time at a very early stage in this project.
Thank you, everybody, and thank you for your patience as I was being escorted off campus by the security guards during the presentation. If you're interested in, we didn't get to the, this presentation's online, so it's easy to find this. You can read it on phase 2 components, and if you're interested in references that we made, you can read up on them. There's a reference page.
So are there any last minute questions that people have? We have 2 minutes before we need to let you go. The Sakai Den will start at 4:10, so I want to make sure that we wrap up on time. So last minute questions, comments, thoughts, reactions?
Just want to say thank you to you, David.
Thank you, Laura. Thank you, Francois.
And we'd definitely be grateful if you would take a few minutes and fill out the feedback form. So you know, maybe now, maybe later, I will promote this a little bit more in the various Slack channels. But we really need your thoughts at this point. So we'd be grateful for them.
And if you're really interested, we might be able to accommodate another member to our working group organizing the work. So just tell us.
Sadly, you'd have to spend time with Dave and me doing our thing, but you know, I don't know whether that's a benefit or a disadvantage.
Yeah, but they would know by watching us. They'll know what it's like. Just all right. Well, thank you, everybody. And I need to get out of this room and let the people that have it scheduled to have it back and go to the correct room.
And we need a break. So thanks all for spending this time with us. I'm going to stop the recording now. And I'm going to end the meeting. So thank you all, and I hope to see many of you in the Sakai Den at 4:10. Take care. Bye all.
Bye, everybody. Thank you for coming.